This is Arthur King, and he's an alcoholic. Arthur is a 33-year-old husband and father that just can't seem to put the bottle down.
And then got drunk instead. He also drank his way through the service, a succession of jobs, and a series of half-hearted cures, with no results but a growing sense of defeat.
So he was admitted into the psych ward Spring Grove Hospital as part of a special unit called the Cottage 13.
Do you consider yourself an alcoholic?
Yes, sir, definitely. It's caused me a lot of trouble in the past, and at this point I feel that I haven't really accomplished anything, and I'd like to start over.
It was an experimental program funded by the government to study how LSD can be used to treat mental problems. So in the fall of 1965, he swallowed an LSD pill and began his 12-hour psychotherapy session.
My son became alive in the picture, and it frightened me. The rose that was placed in front of me at times appeared to be very bright, alive, open, full, maybe breathing at times.
And after just this one session, he never picked up another drink.
6 months after his release from the alcoholics ward at Spring Grove Hospital. Have you had anything to drink, for example?
No, I haven't. Nothing at all. And I haven't had any desire to drink anything.
Arthur's experiment into the use of LSD was part of a much larger movement at the time. This was the golden age of psychedelic research during the 50s and early 60s, to not just cure alcoholism, but to use psychedelics to cure a myriad of things: schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, depression, autism, pain relief. In fact, from 1950 to 1966 alone, over 2,000 papers were published on the therapeutic uses of LSD. It seemed as if science had stumbled upon a miracle cure that was going to change the face of medicine forever. But then, it all came to a grinding halt. Psychedelics are made a Schedule I drug in 1970. Nixon announces drug abuse as America's public enemy number 1, marking the start of the war on drugs.
America's public enemy number 1 in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
And all the psychedelic research grinds to a halt, marking one of the first times in history that such a promising avenue of scientific inquiry was stopped, suppressed for reasons that have nothing to do with the science. The government has successfully suppressed an entire emerging field of research that was saving lives, mind you. So the question is, what happened? What changed between the 20 years or so that turned the golden age of psychedelic research into an outright prohibition? And why is capitalism falling in love with psychedelics again today? If you want to get into business yourself, you're gonna need some hard skills. That's where Skillshare comes in. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes that help people from all over the world discover and strengthen their passions. The people that make the most money in the world today make the most money because they have the best skills, and that's what Skillshare helps you with. There are so many different types of courses available. Whether you want to learn the fundamentals of DSLR photography, the 5 skills to build creative confidence, or how to practice mindfulness meditation, you can find it all on Skillshare. But the first course I'd recommend is Simple Productivity: How to Accomplish More with Less by best-selling author Greg McKeown. It teaches you how to take control of your life and focus on the most important things by following something called essentialism. There are a ton of experts teaching on Skillshare. Skillshare is constantly putting out new classes, there aren't any distracting ads or interruptions during classes, and the entire course catalog is now available with subtitles in Spanish, French, Portuguese, and German. So if you want to start improving your skills and discovering new passions, go to Skillshare.com/Jake to join. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to join will get a 1-month free trial, so you can start learning on Skillshare today. Seriously, self-education totally changed my life, and I love being able to pass this gift on to you guys. So pause the video and click the link below to join Skillshare now. Thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. When you think of psychedelics, you probably imagine a bunch of hippie degenerates in a drum circle or something. But in reality, things like magic mushrooms have been used for thousands of years. In ancient Egypt, people believed mushrooms can make you immortal and were a gift from the god Osiris. Ancient Greece had a famous psychoactive drink called kykeon that was used by high priests in rituals and drank by most peasants. In India, another powerful psychoactive drink, soma, was involved in many ancient religious festivals and ceremonies. They believed it could impart wisdom and immortality to those who used it. And even before the start of Christianity in Europe, mind-altering plants and fungi formed a big part of pagan festivals and rituals. Many believe that our modern-day Santa Claus was based on the idea of a shaman who used psychedelics to communicate with people in the spirit world. A little closer to home, peyote, a cactus-like plant with psychoactive properties, is believed to have been used in the Americas for thousands of years, with Spanish explorers first recording the locals using the plant to overcome hunger and fear in 1519. By 1620, using peyote was classified as a form of witchcraft, and the Spanish believed the drink came from the devil himself. Another psychoactive drink, ayahuasca, is still being used for religious and spiritual ceremonies across South America, and they offer popular retreats for Westerners to try it. Even though psychedelics were common across the world for thousands of years, people always seem to want to keep psychedelics to themselves. They were often designated for use only in religious ceremonies or by the priests of the ancient world. Normal people who used psychedelics were punished for participating in something that was seen as a gift from the gods. There's still a deep mystery surrounding the use of psychedelics in the ancient world, and it wouldn't be until all the way in 1943 that psychedelics really enters the West, when a Swiss chemist discovered LSD and took 250 micrograms of it.
There is the kind of mid-century, 20th century history, which begins with Albert Hofmann, who is a brilliant chemist with the Sandoz company in Switzerland. And he, in effect, invents LSD. First in 1938, but he doesn't know what he has yet. But then in 1943, in the middle of World War II, he got this premonition that this was a particularly interesting and beautiful molecule, and he should take a second look at it, and he resynthesized it.
LSD was discovered by the chemist Albert Hofmann, who took 250 micrograms of it as an experiment and proceeded to go on what we would call today an acid trip. He labeled the drug LSD-25, and the company he worked for, Sandoz Laboratories, started making the drug available for research, and expectations grew that LSD could possibly help patients undergo psychotherapy.
Sandoz, the company he worked for, really didn't know what was it good for. How could you use this drug? How could you monetize it, as we would say? So Sandoz does something very interesting. They organize, basically a crowd-searched research project where they offer LSD to any researcher, therapist who wants it for free.
Albert Hofmann's LSD trip was the spark that led to the golden age of psychedelic research. LSD was touted as a wonder drug, and everyone who was anyone doing scientific research raced to be the first to determine its beneficial qualities. Between the 1950s and 60s alone, more than 2,000 research papers were written about LSD, psilocybin, and other psychedelic drugs. More than 40,000 people were given these drugs in research groups, and the industry made huge leaps in understanding the effects of psychedelics to treat depression, alcoholism, and other mental health illnesses. The power of psychedelics was so intoxicating, even the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous experimented with LSD and found it to be more effective than the 12-step program he helped create. Even the churches got behind psychedelics, with some people finding it could inspire and enhance unique religious experiences. Unfortunately, the psychedelic craze also attracted the attention of the CIA, which led to the dark side of the psychedelic age, the CIA's MKUltra experiments. The first government-backed research into psychedelics started in Boston in 1949. It was secretly funded by the CIA and US Army, and by 1951, reports claimed that the Soviet Union had purchased around 50 million doses of LSD from Sandoz Laboratories. Afraid of what the Soviets could be doing with it, the CIA launched a series of weird and sometimes horrifying psychedelic experiments on the US population to weaponize LSD. Tests were done to see if LSD could work as a truth serum, experiments were conducted to determine if it can make Soviet spies defect, or if spraying LSD on enemy troops could work as a weapon of mass distraction. LSD was even given without consent to mental patients, prisoners, workers of the world's oldest profession, and drug addicts. Quote, people who could not fight back, end quote, as one agency officer put it, so they could study its effects. In many cases, LSD was given to people without them knowing. The CIA even set up brothel experiments, where they would give men who went to the brothel LSD without their knowledge, so they could blackmail them into not speaking out about it if they found out, aka Operation Midnight Climax. The government took it so far as to use LSD to torture people for information, threatening them that their trip would continue forever if they didn't share their secrets. People died and were seriously debilitated in this line of research, and a substance that has been shown so much promise had been turned into a weapon against the same people it was supposed to help. But then, something happened that would forever change the course of psychedelics in the West, taking it from the golden age of research and slowly eroding it into prohibition. And it all started with the vice president of JP Morgan, Gordon Wasson. Him and his family participated in a mushroom ceremony in Mexico in 1955. By his account, he was the first white man to participate in this ritual, and he wrote about his experience in the 1957 issue of Life magazine. The article went viral and was the catalyst that brought LSD and psychedelics into the public spotlight. From the moment that article went live, it will mark the beginning of the death of psychedelics from a miracle cure to the #1 threat to society just 10 years later. What happened between 1957 and 1968 that caused opinions on psychedelics to change so dramatically? The 1960s ushered in an era of social upheaval. Under the burden of the Vietnam War, widespread racial discrimination, the Cold War, the rebellious hippie culture emerged, and the activists of the time really believed that they could change mainstream culture. The substance of choice for this new counterculture? LSD. Psychedelics quickly escaped from the labs and made their way to the streets where they became a recreational sensation. And LSD became the party drug of the decade, and also as a sign of rebellion. At the time, the research on LSD continued, and one of those researchers was a guy named Timothy Leary. He was a lecturer and behavioral psychologist at Harvard University and went to Mexico to try mushrooms for himself. That trip, he said, taught him more in 15 minutes than he had learned in 15 years as a therapist, and he came back to the States eager to test the drug's other therapeutic properties. So Leary partnered with Richard Albert and founded the Harvard Psilocybin Project to research psychedelics at Harvard. Psilocybin is the active chemical in magic mushrooms, and since psychedelics were so new to the West back then, people often treated psilocybin, LSD, and other psychedelics as the same thing. So they decided to test LSD on prisoners, addicts, church members, college students, and themselves, which drew a ton of criticism from the press. LSD quickly escaped the labs, which led to students using it, a black market formed near Harvard, a hippie commune formed near the school, forcing the school to ban the drug and eventually fired the two researchers. But Leary was a true believer in how psychedelics could transform society, so he formed the International Foundation for Internal Freedom, eventually reinventing himself as the high priest of psychedelics, leading the counterculture movement in America, setting up communes, telling the youth to turn on, tune in, drop out from society, the war, the government, corporations, etc. In other words, this new movement went against everything the establishment and government stood for. It went against the war effort, it went against consumerism that fueled the economy, it went against authority, and it was all fueled in part by LSD and other psychedelics.
Richard Nixon called Leary the most dangerous man in America. He felt that LSD and other drugs were sapping the will of American boys to fight in Vietnam, and he may well have been right. I mean, LSD encourages people to think for themselves, to not accept the frames of social values, the games that we play socially. And in important ways, LSD did fuel the counterculture and was very threatening to adult society and to the powers that be.
So in 1966, LSD is banned. Sandoz, the company that was making LSD, stops producing it, and the ban is followed by dozens of reports of the sudden discovery of the dangers of the substance. All experiments on LSD came to an end, and one of the most promising drugs of the 20th century becomes an illegal narcotic. 2 years later, psilocybin is banned, and the prohibition on psychedelics turns into a full-blown war on drugs.
This is your brain. This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?
America's public enemy #1 in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
In an unprecedented move in science, psychedelics are made an illegal Schedule I substance. Not because it was proven that they were actually dangerous, but because it was a threat to the government's power and because it made for a good political tool. This is what John Ehrlichman, Nixon's own domestic policy advisor, had to say about the true intentions behind the war on drugs. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and psychedelics, and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. The scheduling for psychedelics also made no sense. Schedule I drugs are classified as having the highest risk for abuse and psychological or physical dependence. However, most researchers agree that psychedelics are actually anti-addictive, meaning that their effects are weakened the more frequently you take them. Meanwhile, drugs like cocaine and meth, which are way more addictive and dangerous, aren't even as high on the scheduling list. Before psychedelics, psychiatry had been stuck in the 19th century, but not even these developments can make up for the mess LSD and psilocybin had created in the eyes of the government. Decades of work and research was wasted. And this gave way to a generation of adults and doctors who were taught that psychedelics were nothing more than dangerous substances with no benefit to society. And by the end of the 1970s, for most people, LSD is nothing but an old-fashioned mistake from the past. The research dies out, and we enter into the dark ages of psychedelic research. In the end, it took more than 2 decades for research on psychedelics to begin again. In 1992, Dr. Rick Strassman started studying DMT.
DMT.
That same year, the FDA passed the Prescription Drug User Fee Act to encourage research on new drugs. And since DMT wasn't as well known or as stigmatized as other psychedelics, DMT studies were approved far more easily. Then in 1999, Johns Hopkins Hospital restarted its own psychedelic research with private funding, and psychotherapy started gaining traction again. And ever so slowly, the research picked back up. The stigma slowly went away bit by bit into today, the renaissance of psychedelics. Today, the war on drugs has come under serious scrutiny, and in the case of psychedelics, a glimmer of hope can be seen. One of the biggest victories against the war on drugs in the US was the legalization of psychedelic therapy in Oregon. This was part of the vote to decriminalize the possession of all drugs. Even Washington, D.C. talked about decriminalizing all psychedelic plants. And the research has been growing exponentially as well. Studies find that psilocybin can help build new connections between brain cells, trials show that ecstasy and counseling can help people with severe PTSD, and research has finally proven that psychedelics are not addictive, don't cause organ damage, and don't make holes in your brain. One of the more popular psychedelics today, MDMA, which is also known as ecstasy or Molly, is showing a lot of promise with helping with PTSD and is one of the most exciting research paths right now. And all this progress, decriminalization, promising research, and a much more open mind from the public has sparked a gold rush into the psychedelic industry. And universities, entrepreneurs, Wall Street, and venture capitalists want in. As Michael Pollan puts it, capitalism is falling in love with psychedelics right now. Recently, Harvard researcher David Sinclair talked about how e-doctor mental health startups will be the next billion-dollar companies because of the mental health crisis caused by social media.
Crazy age.
We do.
It's fun, but stressful for a lot of people.
Well, and for your study, for the study of human life extension and anti-aging, when you look at the stresses that are they're very novel to the human experience, like the stresses of social media, the stresses of cell phone use, the stresses of blue light, like staring at screens at night, like all that stuff. Like, how much of an effect do you think that's having on people, and have we even quantified that yet?
We are quantifying it, and it's having a real negative effect. Mental health issues is going to be the medical problem of the 21st century, no question. There are companies that are doing these remote video chats with a psychologist or psychiatrist. They are booming. These are the next billion-dollar companies.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, anyone want to make money, look into that.
The anxiety, depression, and stress caused by social media that will make these e-doctor startups billion-dollar companies could very well be the same reason why psychedelic startups may be the next billion-dollar companies as well. They say it's only a matter of time before the FDA approves the use of psychoactive drugs in therapy, and many believe MDMA will be legalized by 2023, with psilocybin just a few years after that. So the best universities in the country like Yale, Johns Hopkins, the University of California, and Berkeley are racing to prepare laboratories and trials to study psychedelics, while investors are emptying their pockets into startups and independent research labs that are simply waiting for the okay before making their products available. After almost 50 years of secrecy, government propaganda, and lies surrounding the dangers of psychedelics are once again on the verge of taking the scientific and recreational world by storm. With all that's happening around the legalization of psychedelics and their research, a few key players have popped up in the industry. Field Trip Health, a Canadian company that runs high-end ketamine clinics across the US. Right now, they're focusing on developing a new psychedelic therapy that is as strong as psilocybin but works in around half the time. MindMed uses psychedelic-inspired therapy and microdoses of LSD to help patients reap the benefits without experiencing a full-blown trip. Compass Pathways is a mental health facility currently investing $240 million into clinical trials on psilocybin across 10 different countries, while Atai Life Sciences is a biopharma company that makes all of Compass's trials possible. As a society, we've elevated some substances to the center of our society while irrationally demonizing a ton of others that could potentially be beneficial. Because of the war on drugs, we've lumped them all together even though so many of them are completely different. Stimulants, depressants, psychedelics that have all been squeezed into this one-size-fits-all thing when it comes to how to integrate them into society. Caffeine is an example of a substance that's perfectly integrated into society. In fact, caffeine has kind of fueled capitalism. Quote, the coffee break tells you all you need to know about the links between capitalism and caffeine. The idea that your employer would give you a free drug and then pay time in which to enjoy it tells you everything, end quote. Alcohol is also relatively well integrated into society even though it's addictive. We have norms like you probably shouldn't drink until the evening.
It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon and you're piss-ass drunk.
And yet with all the promises of psychedelics, it's not integrated in society at all. But it could be. And it wouldn't be too far off to imagine a world where psychedelic retreats, trip guides, psychedelic therapy could all be commonplace like some companies are already trying to do. Have you done psychedelics before? If you have, what was your experience? Was it good? Was it terrifying? Let me know in the comments below. And also what you guys think about psychedelics and the legalization of them as well. As I mentioned before, I've never done psychedelics before and I didn't want to do them before this video because I didn't want to come off as just some hippie that does mushrooms that made this video so that you can make them legal to enjoy more mushrooms. I didn't want that image, but I am not saying that's off the table for the future. If you are new here, we make video essays just like this one every single week on the most provocative, thought-provoking stuff in the world of business. All the way from why do Chinese billionaires disappear, to why haven't we seen hyperinflation yet, to the economics of the mafia. If you subscribe, you will not regret it, I can promise you that. And if you do, you can always dislike, unsubscribe, and leave me your best hate comments in the comments below so you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. If you want more behind the scenes stuff, day in the life kind of stuff, you can follow me on Instagram at jaketran.io. And that is gonna wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. You've been awesome. I've been Jake. Stay dangerous out there, and I will see you guys in the next one.